The town had one forge, one smith, and one engineer who hadn't slept a full night since arriving. That arithmetic was not going to work. I understood it the way you understand a bad tolerance stack, not as a single catastrophic failure, but as the accumulation of small insufficiencies, each one acceptable in isolation, each one compounding the next until the whole assembly seizes. One shop could not outproduce a failing veil. One pair of hands could not outwork the mathematics of collapse. I had been trying anyway, the way a man will keep tightening a stripped bolt, long past the point of reason, because stopping means admitting the thread is gone. The morning I finally stopped, I walked to the center of the market square and said it plainly. I don't need strong backs or noble blood. I need people who can learn. Anyone, everyone, come and learn. The words landed in the square like a stone into still water. A few heads turned, then a few more. Iron ridges overlooked, the ones who had learned to stand at the edges of things, to take up the least possible space, began, cautiously, to drift forward. A woman with ink-stained fingers, a boy of maybe 12, who had been sweeping the apothecary's step, two men from the eastern quarter whose names I did not yet know. They moved the way people move when they half expect to be told they've misunderstood, that the invitation wasn't meant for them. It was meant for them, specifically for them. I can't outwork this. I have to outteach it. That was the whole of the plan, such as it was. He came late in the morning, after the initial crowd had sorted itself into the curious and the committed. I noticed him because he held himself the way veterans hold themselves, weight distributed with the unconscious precision of someone who has learned that the ground is not always trustworthy, and because his left sleeve was pinned at the elbow, the fabric folded and secured with the neat economy of long habit. He stopped at the edge of the gathering and did not drift forward with the others. He watched. When our eyes met, he crossed the distance between us with his chin up. What use is half a man at an anvil, Outlander? His voice was level, not bitter, the way a man sounds when he has asked a question so many times it has worn smooth. Don't mock me with charity. I looked at him, the way he'd read the crowd in 30 seconds, the way he'd positioned himself with sightlines to every approach, the way the younger men near him had unconsciously shifted to give him room, not from pity, but from some animal recognition of authority. Can you teach frightened men to hold a line? I asked. A pause. Something shifted behind his eyes. Then you can teach them to hold a tolerance. I don't need your arm. I need what's in your head. His name was Doh Gwang. He had held a mountain pass for 3 days with 14 men and no resupply. He did not tell me this himself. I learned it later, in pieces, from people who said it the way people say things they consider obvious. He stood there in the market square for a long moment, weighing something I couldn't see, and then he gave a single short nod and stepped into the group. The boy arrived at a run. He was perhaps 16, slight, with the kind of energy that has nowhere adequate to put itself. It came off him in visible waves, in the way he couldn't quite stand still, in the way his hands moved when he spoke, as though they were trying to help the words along. I can learn. I learn fast, I swear it. Pick me, please, I'll work all night. Beside him, a familiar face, Chae-young, my first apprentice, who had the grace to look both fond and exasperated. Breathe, Jae, he already said everyone. The boy, Mok Jae, stopped, blinked, looked at me, then at Chae-young, then back at me, as though verifying that the world had in fact arranged itself in his favor. Then he grinned, and it was the kind of grin that makes a room feel slightly warmer, and I thought, this one is going to be trouble in the best possible way. Not everyone in the square was pleased. The respectable folk gathered at a distance, the way respectable folk do when they want to observe something they disapprove of, without being seen to participate in it. I heard the comment clearly. It was not meant to be quiet. Cripples, rats, and a madman from the sky. This is the rabble that's going to save Iron Ridge? The laughter that followed was the small, mean kind. I was calculating how to respond, whether to respond, when Warden Ji Wol-yeong's voice cut across the square with the clean precision of a cold chisel. Their iron held the gate 3 nights ago, while you barred your doors and prayed. The laughter stopped. Ji Wol-yeong did not raise her voice further. She didn't need to. There was a quality to her stillness in that moment, a cold anger, the kind that has been compressed rather than vented, that made the air around her feel thinner. The next mouth that calls them rabble can go stand on the wall themselves. She let the silence sit for a moment. Anyone? No? No one answered. The respectable folk found other places to be. I filed the moment away. The warden had her own reasons for everything she did, and I had learned not to assume I understood them. But I was grateful. In the spare way I am grateful for things, the way you're grateful for a square that checks true, without needing to make ceremony of it. The first problem was Baek Tae-ho. Not that he was unwilling. Tae-ho was, in his way, deeply willing. He wanted the cohort to learn, I think, in the same way he wanted the iron to behave, which was to say with the full force of his considerable will, directed at the outcome, and a limited patience for the gap between desire and result. The difficulty was that Tae-ho had learned his craft in his hands over 30 years, and his hands knew things his mouth had never been asked to explain. I watched him try 3 times in one morning. Each time he would begin with some confidence, demonstrate a technique at the anvil with the fluid economy of genuine mastery, and then turn to find the apprentices watching him with the polite blankness of people who have seen something happen very quickly and understood none of it. You hit it until gah. He set down his hammer, picked it up, set it down again. You feel it. How do I say what my arm just knows? That's why we wrote it down, Beck, I said, so you don't have to. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment, which I had come to understand was his version of considering a point seriously. The technical notes I had been drafting, the accumulated process knowledge, reduced to marks on paper, were not a replacement for his hands. They were a scaffold, a way to give the apprentices enough framework that Tae-ho's demonstrations could land somewhere instead of passing through empty air. He grumbled. He always grumbled. He also began, slowly and with visible reluctance, to use the notes. The training was not elegant. Slow is smooth, smooth is accurate, accurate is everything. Again, I said it so many times in those first weeks that it stopped being words and became something closer to a rhythm, a cadence the cohort could carry in their bodies while their hands learned the work. File, saw, square, read the rule, the same motions, repeated until the motion stopped requiring thought, until thought could be freed for the next layer. They were not a natural cohort. They were the people Iron Ridge had decided it did not need, the veteran with one arm, the orphan boys, the woman who had been told her whole life that this kind of work was not for her, the man from the eastern quarter whose accent made the merchants speak slowly at him as though he were simple. They had in common only that they had been discarded, and that they had come forward anyway when someone said come. That turned out to be enough. Doh Gwang found his place within the first 3 days, and it was not at the anvil. It was in the space between the anvil and the door, in the way a workshop breathes, the flow of bodies and tools and attention that determines whether a place is safe or merely lucky. He had spent 20 years keeping men alive in conditions that wanted them dead, and a forge workshop, it turned out, presented a recognizable set of problems. A clean shop is a shop where everyone still has all their fingers tomorrow. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard over noise. He was looking at a young man from the eastern quarter who had let his attention wander toward the fire in the forge. You, eyes on your work, not the fire. The young man snapped back. Doh Gwang moved on without ceremony. I watched this and thought, foreman, the word fit the way a well-made part fits its housing, without forcing, without play. By the end of the second week, Mok Jae had filed his first true surface. I was not present for the exact moment, but I heard it, the sound of Chayoung's voice, which I had come to associate with careful understatement, suddenly carrying something unguarded. It's flat, Jae, it's actually flat. You did it. I came around the bench to find Mok Jae holding the piece of iron with both hands, turning it in the lamplight, his face doing something complicated. He was 16 and had spent most of his life being told in various ways that things were not for him. And now he was holding a surface he had made true with his own hands, and Cho-young had checked it and confirmed it, and the world was briefly arranged in a configuration he had not expected. I did it! The words came out louder than he intended. He caught himself, looked around at the other apprentices who were now watching him, and seemed briefly uncertain whether to be embarrassed. Then he held the piece up. I made something true! The embarrassment didn't win. The joy did. Several of the other apprentices grinned. Even Taeho, at the far end of the shop, made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite approval, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I turned back to my own work. The feeling in my chest was not quite pride. Pride implies ownership, and this was his, but it was adjacent to something. The satisfaction of a process that has produced its intended result, multiplied by the fact that the process was a person. Sorin came in the evenings. The acolyte had her own reasons for everything, as the warden did, and I had learned to accept the help without requiring full accounting of the motivation. She sat up in the corner of the workshop after the day's physical training was done, when the apprentices were tired and their hands needed rest, and she taught them letters and numbers by lamplight. She was a better teacher than I had expected, which I recognized as a failure of expectation on my part. She had a way of making the abstract feel necessary, not useful in the vague future tense way that adults use to motivate children, but necessary now, in the specific and immediate sense. A craftsman who can read can learn from someone who died before he was born. Her voice in the lamplight was even, unhurried. The apprentices were watching her with the particular attention of people who have been given something they didn't know they were hungry for. That is the closest thing to immortality I have ever found, closer than the temple ever offered me. The last sentence landed differently than the rest. I saw a few of the apprentices register it, the small shift of expression that means a person has heard something that rearranges something else. Salyan did not elaborate. She moved on to the next character, the next numeral, the chalk marks accumulating on the board she had brought from the acolyte's hall. Late one evening, Taeho and I stood at the edge of the workshop and watched the cohort work. The lamps threw warm light across bent heads and moving hands. The sound was the sound of people learning, not the fluid competence of mastery, but the slower, more effortful sound of skill being built from nothing, stroke by stroke. Half of them can barely hold a file straight, Smith, Taeho said. Today, I said, you're not building tools, Beck. You're building the people who will build the tools. That outlasts every blade you ever forged. He was quiet for a moment. I could not tell if he was persuaded or simply tired. With Taeho, the two sometimes looked the same. The lamps burned late. That was the last thing I noticed before I left for the night. The workshop still lit, the cohort still bent over their work. Doh Gwang's silhouette in the doorway, where he had positioned himself to watch both the interior and the street beyond. He was not looking at the apprentices. He was looking at the dark outside the circle of lamplight, the dark where the veil's pale edge was visible, if you knew where to look, thinner than it had been a month ago, the light of it more like memory than presence. I could not hear what he was thinking, but I had learned to read the set of a man's shoulders, and what I read in his was not fear. It was the particular readiness of someone who has waited a long time to have something worth defending again, and who intends this time not to waste it. Let it come, his posture said. This time we'll be ready. This time it'll mean something. I left him to his watch and walked back through the dark toward my own work, carrying the arithmetic of the day. One forge, one smith, one engineer. And now, finally, the beginning of something that might actually be enough. Not because the tools were better, but because there were more hands to hold them, and those hands were learning. The discarded, building the thing that would outlast the order that had discarded them. The veil flickered at the edge of town, pale and thin. We would need to be faster.